Hello and welcome. My name is Carsten Lützen. I'm an agile coach and a facilitator, and today I'll talk about how Scrum uses constraints, because it's, in my world at least, quite interesting. So Scrum gives us a sprint goal, a sprint, and a definition of done, for instance. It comes up with some events, some artifacts, some product goals, some values, and then it leaves the rest for us as the ones that are going to actually enact Scrum. So it leaves a lot of free will to us, but there are some things that we need to do, for instance, a sprint goal, and a definition of done. And when we then look at Cynefin, this is where it gets quite interesting. We often talk about constraints, and a constraint shape a system. It shapes something. So a good analogy that I like to use is that riverbanks shape the river. They help point the river in a direction, and then the river flows in that direction. So that is often what we call an enabling constraint. It helps give us a direction. The river can also overflow, so it's not a hard boundary, but it gives us a direction. We also have governing constraints, which are these lines that we are simply not allowed to cross no matter what. And when we are talking about Scrum and product development in Cynefin, we work in a complex problem. And in a complex problem, that is where enabling constraints can really help us. And that is also, Scrum is often seen as a container of a lot of enabling constraints. So an enabling constraint is, for instance, a sprint. A sprint gives us a direction. A sprint doesn't say what we need to do, it just says we have this much time to do something. So it gives us a narrowed scope. We also have a sprint goal. Again, it doesn't say what to do. At least if you're doing it somewhat sane, it doesn't say exactly what to do. It just gives you a goal that you should adhere to, something that we can measure or another way validate. And then we figure out what is then happening, or what happened. Oh, now it became a goat, sorry. You get what I mean. So those are examples of enabling constraints. But we also have some governing constraints in Scrum, things that we are simply not allowed to cross. For instance, the definition of done, that is, I'm lazy, so I'll just write DOD. That is a governing constraint. So we need to make sure that all points in this definition of done is checked off before we can actually put it into production. We cannot ship something that doesn't live up to the definition of done. That's a hardcore rule, right? So that is a governing constraint. And the difference between these are, back to the river example, enabling constraints gives a direction, and a governing constraint really puts a hard boundary. You're not allowed to cross this. So if you look at your team, if you only have governing constraints in your team, then you get a team that only follows a process and don't dare to do anything that steps out the line. If you're clever about your constraints, if you actually give them enabling constraints, leave a lot of freedom for them to figure out what is a good way of navigating within these constraints, that is when you get a team that works much more independent and often also have a lot more ownership and pride about what they're building, because they feel and they also own the solution space instead of being boxed in by these rigid rules. So if we look at companies, often old production companies, for instance, they often have a lot of governing constraints because governing constraints works well in production, but IT, product management, innovation, to some extent innovation, are much better suited with a set of good enabling constraints. So I would encourage you to go and look at your team. What constraints have you put up for your team? And then if they're all governing, maybe take a step back and figure out how can you change them to good enabling constraints instead. If you like this, please consider subscribing and sharing. That would be super awesome. And as always, if you have comments, questions, ideas, or feedback to these videos, please leave a comment or send me a message. That would also be awesome. That's it. Have a super awesome day.